Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining our webinar today. You know, we've been seeing a lot of changes across the restaurant industry as a whole, making some pretty significant changes to their menu offerings post-COVID. So we felt this would be an ideal time to really dive into the importance of menu engineering and why this is key in ensuring that your menu is still in line with your targeted cost of goods and budgeting goals, but also, you know, helping with that increasing of the top line revenue margins. So my name is Lynn, and I am joined today with Brian McCaig. Brian and I are both client advisors at RSI. For those of you that have been on our webinars before, you obviously know who we are. Thank you for joining us again. You're going to see our contact information on the screen. We work closely with owners and operators on a deeper, more strategic level, so feel free to reach out to us anytime if you've got any questions or have any need for any type of consultation. Now today, the purpose of our call is to first review the difference between recipe costing versus menu engineering. We're going to go into the whys behind why we're suggesting that you need to put time and thought into engineering your new menu or your existing menu. We're also going to help you understand how those menu items are impacting your margins and how you can identify those winners and losers. And then finally, how you can then track your ideal, theoretical, and actual costs week over week and how they align with your budget. So let's actually get started today with our first poll question. Brian, what do you got for us?
Perfect. And before we even get into the poll question, it's a good time for me to let everybody know there is a Q&A section of the webinar. We'd encourage you to get your live questions in. We're going to try to keep this to about half an hour. We're going to do our best, and we're going to try to leave some time to address those live questions as they come in. So I encourage you to use that feature of the webinar. And in addition, we're going to be doing some poll questions, and let's get into our first poll question. And it is, have you costed out your menu? You may say no, never. You may say yes, but not in a long time. Or you may say yes, and the price points stay up to date. I make sure that stays up to date. Okay, so I'm going to get the poll question up on your screen. It should be right now up on your screen. Once everybody gets their questions in, we're going to go ahead and share the results with the class. I'm curious to see how this comes in, Sid.
Yeah, you know, it could go either way. I'm sure some of you have, and hopefully you have, but if not, thanks for joining us today, and we're going to give you all the tips and tricks regarding it.
Absolutely. And God, I see a ton of answers coming in. I still see them coming in, so I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds, 10 more seconds to get those in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So check that out. It kind of is all over the board, Sydney. Some people are honest enough to say, hey, I've never really gotten into that. I've never costed out my menu. Some people have, but are having trouble keeping up with it and making sure the prices are up to date. And some, kudos to you guys, high five, are keeping up with it and making sure that the prices are staying up to date and keeping up with their menu engineering. So here's the good news. No matter how you answered, I believe we'll be able to provide you some value today. And for those of you who this is your very first time even considering menu engineering, hopefully we can convince you that it's a valuable way to go. That being said, hey Sid, let's talk about recipe costing and how that works by itself.
Yeah, so what we really need to make sure that you understand is there is a difference between recipe costing and menu engineering. So I'm sure most of you have actually been through the exercise before, but basically recipe costing is when you break down the cost of every ingredient to its applicable unit of measure, and then along with how much of each ingredient is being used in your dish. You know, when you're breaking down that raw product to its unit of measure, you know, don't forget to always be factoring the accurate yield of the raw product, and as well as the yield of the prepped recipe as well, since these will also make an impact on the overall cost of the dish. Once this exercise has been completed, that total cost of the dish is then divided into what you are going to price that item for on your menu to actually give you your plate cost percentage. So basically, if an item that costs you $3 and you price it at $10, then you're going to be running a 30% cost on that item or getting a 70% margin from it. Now, the problem with recipe costing is that it's not factoring in the quantity you're selling. So you could have recipes that are margined at 20% food cost and other recipes that are margined at 40% food cost. That does not mean that your overall theoretical food cost is 30%. You have to factor in the quantity sold of these items to know your true theoretical cost, which is why menu engineering is what you really need to be doing. So with menu engineering, you'll still be costing out that recipe. There's no change in that first, item breaking down that recipe cost. But then you also need to link that information to your product mix. This is going to enable you to truly understand the true margin impact that each menu item is having on your overall cost of goods. Now, to really know what your true theoretical cost is, you need to factor in the total quantity sold and how much the items are being sold for. Now, for you to know what your final cost, what that final cost is on each item. Now, you have to keep in mind that the actual sold price may not be the price listed on your menu. So what I mean by that is your actual sold price will be the average price on the item less any comps and discounts. I want to give you kind of an example of that. So I had a client recently offer a limited time offer on one of his highest velocity items. He, was one of his top sellers. He did a month-long promotion on it. He did a BOGO offer, buy one, get one free on it. And his cost of goods went through the roof during this promotion. Instead of collecting his normal $15, he was really only getting an average price of $7.50 per item. And he already had a fairly significant cost on this plate item. So his food cost went up dramatically because it was his highest velocity item selling the most of. So this will impact your overall cost of goods. So that's something to be thinking about. Now, once you have engineered all your recipes, then you should be able to see each week how much was sold of each item, what that total revenue generated by each item is. You're also going to be able to see the total cost price based off the total quantity sold, which is then going to give you your theoretical cost of goods solely based off of what was sold. Since you have different amounts of quantity sold daily and weekly on every single item, then your theoretical cost will fluctuate week over week. This will also help to see what impact that each menu item is making on your overall top line revenue, which is all extremely important for us right now. Top line is what we're all needing to worry about, especially with everything that we're dealing with COVID. So with that, I think, Brian, it's a good time for another poll question.
All right, let's keep it going. A lot of fun with the poll questions. So this one's a little bit two parts. So first off, have you made changes to pricing or portion sizes post-COVID or during COVID? And secondly, do you know your ideal costs on those updates? You may say, yes, I've made changes to pricing or portion sizes, and I do know my ideal cost. Or you may say, yes, I've made changes to pricing and portion sizes, but I haven't really thought about my ideal cost. I don't know that ideal cost. Or you may say, no, I have not made changes to my pricing, to my portion sizes. All right, just like the last one, I'm going to get that poll question up on your screen. It should be up now.
What's even better would be if those updates on the prices were auto-updating, right, Brian?
Yeah, that would be extra credit there, right?
Absolutely.
Wow, this is amazing. Right now, it's split down the board. I'll share the results with you in a second. Thank you, everyone, for getting your answers in. It's pretty amazing how directly split down the board it is right now. A lot of people having to make changes. So it looks like right now about 2/3 have had to make a change to their pricing or portion sizes. That's not a surprise, right, Sydney?
No, we're seeing a lot of that across the board, not across the industry, but especially with our clients. We're seeing a lot of, pivoting to different menu offerings, going off of supply and demand, and, what's, people are interested in having. So,
or rethinking their portion sizes to fit in a to-go box, right? Because a lot of people have to-go boxes as a big part of their revenue right now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling. Looks like everyone got their answers in. And look at this. I mean, the winner is, yes, you've made changes, and yeah, you do know your ideal cost. But man, that's a tight race.
All right. Well,
right down the middle for everybody. All right.
Well, I think for those that haven't, let's talk about why you should.
Yeah, let's talk about why you should put the time into menu engineering. And first things first, it gives you an increased understanding of your cost of goods budget and how it impacts your break even. So if you're a regular of these webinars, first of all, thank you guys so much. We've really been blown away by the amount of restaurateurs who have been registering for these and the positive feedback we've received. And no surprise, this webinar you're on right now, menu engineering, has been one of the most popular ones we've put out there by the sheer number of people who've registered. So thank you, everyone. That being said, if you've been on webinars of ours before, you know Sid and I are not going to go a single webinar without talking about budgets, without talking about break-even analysis, probably to the point where you're sick of hearing it. But there's a reason we talk about budgets so much, right, Sid?
Absolutely, and it may be ad nauseum, but it's all in your best interest.
All right, well, here I go again. Definitively, the most successful restaurant operators work off of a budget. And understanding your recipe costing and menu engineering helps you understand your food costs and your pour cost targets. Remember, if your menu is engineered at a certain level, so your cost is a certain level, you know that cost, that doesn't mean that's your budget target. Nobody's going to have zero waste, right? So if you figure out your recipe costs and figure out your menu engineering and you get a true theoretical cost of X, you're going to need to factor in at least 1 to 2, sometimes a 3 percentage point bump for what your actual budget should be. And obviously, you want it to be lower, and depending on how skilled your team is at managing waste, maybe you can have a lower 1 to 2% bump. But don't think you can have a 0% bump. What you cost it out as should not be your budget. I don't care how good you and your team think you are, right? There's a cost of doing business, and there's some inherent waste in every product, which we'll talk about. Once you know your budgeting targets, let that trickle down into all aspects of your business. So I'm talking specifically your ordering par levels, your forecast. These are all impacted by menu engineering, and let this trickle down into everything so that you know where to budget, where to forecast. All right. I'm a big fan of sharing stories and sharing best practices between restaurants and different restaurants I work with. A good one I had in regards to menu engineering, hopefully everyone can learn from this one. It stuck with me. I was working with a bar in Texas. They had a pour cost problem. And they reached out to me because their liquor costs, their pour costs had actually jumped 5 percentage points in just 1 month, and they couldn't figure out why. And this was a bar that actually had it pretty dialed in. They freaked out about a 0.5 percentage point difference in their pour costs from 1 week to the next. So a 5-point increase was like, oh my gosh, something is absolutely wrong. Brian, help us out. We got a bar meeting together. We got the whole bar team together, and we started round tabling solutions or ideas. Everyone had different theories. Some theories were better than others, but it was one of those, hey, let's just throw it all out there and learn from each other. None of the theories that I was hearing seemed impactful enough for me to explain that 5% bump. But then magic happened. One of the bartenders casually mentioned, hey, we did start doing bulk recipes every shift for Moscow mules instead of making them to order. Could that have had a difference? So knowing this bar like I did, I knew Moscow mules were what they were known for, and it was a big chunk of their revenue. And my next question to the whole team at the meeting was, hey, what's that recipe for the bulk mix? And the bartender kind of rolled their eyes and joked that, you know, yeah, we kind of figure it out as we go, and we kind of eyeball it. I'm sure a lot of you have been in that situation before. When we figured out what they were actually making, we costed it out and figured out, how, okay, you make a one-time bulk recipe. How many Moscow mules does that work, or does that make? How much are you selling it for? They were costed out at 38%. And if you're listening to me on the last side, you know that doesn't mean that it was a 38% cost, because you have a little bit of inherent waste in there. It was 39% at best. And the rest of their whole cocktail program was costed out around an 18 to 20%. So this was a huge impact for them, not to mention it made up a huge portion of their revenue. If we go back to what Sid mentioned about true menu engineering rather than just recipe costing, you understand that this one recipe could have a huge impact on theoretical costs if it is that high velocity item, like Sydney said. So I can't remember what the solution was. Either they changed the price or they changed the recipe. What stuck with me, one, was Moscow Mule, because that's one of my go-to drinks. And the other thing that stuck out to me was, hey, they made a big improvement almost immediately. Whether they changed the price or whether they changed the recipe, I don't know. But it's one that stuck with me because it was such a valuable lesson for everybody at that table. Everyone at that table walked away from that meeting understanding, hey, little decisions like that can have a big impact on everything. And I really think menu engineering, and because we costed out the recipe and factored in menu engineering, I really think it hit home for everybody at that meeting. It was such a big win. So this was one possible reason for a change or a big increase in your theoretical food costs. Another reason, especially considering the times we're in, might be a change in the actual cost of the ingredients in your recipe. So let's also talk about being able to see and track your commodity price fluctuations. If you are monitoring your menu engineering and theoretical costs and you see that bump in theoretical margins, I want you ready to look into whether there's been a change in the price that you're paying for that ingredient. Track your commodity prices, and if there is a change, find which recipes these ingredients factor into, and look at how those margins have changed from your initial ideal cost. Everybody on the poll question said, yeah, I did change a lot of portion sizes, and I changed the price I sold for some stuff. Hey, do you know that ideal cost? Have you looked at that change? Once you identify the change like we're looking at right now, do you know what kind of impact that had on your ideal cost for some of your high velocity menu items?
Something to think about.
Yeah.
There's been so much going on with the supply chain market out there, with price fluctuations on pork, et cetera. And I know that, back in March when COVID first hit, they canceled March Madness, and all of a sudden chicken wings had a surplus of it, and they dropped the price on chicken wings down to like pennies on the dollar, it seemed. So it's going to be important too to kind of see, especially over the next few months and going into 2021, what will start occurring with your supply chain. What's going to not be harder to get, what's going to be easier to get, and making those, pivots to your menu based off of those fluctuations that you're seeing. Brian, I think you've had a couple too, you've seen.
Yeah, I've definitely, I heard stories about pork tripling. It's really volatile right now. And your story about chicken wings, it makes me laugh because, man, that is why I learned in Economics 101 about supply and demand and when the price is going to go up. So that class was worthwhile, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, menu engineering gives you visibility into so much more information about your business as well, and it starts with portion sizes, in my opinion. That's going to help you determine and stick to your proper portion sizes and helps you balance, as always, the value to the guest and the value to your profitability as well. So knowing if it's the right portion size that you're getting out and it passes the test of what you're trying to cost your recipes out at. We'll talk a little more specifically about waste in a little bit, but man, that's one of the biggest things you can get out of menu engineering is helping identify waste. If there's a big difference, again, between your theoretical costs and what your cost actually comes in at, then you may have a waste problem to dive into. And it could be traditional, spoiled product, or maybe your employees aren't following those portion sizes or those recipes that you're throwing out. Again, we'll talk about this one a little more specifically later in the presentation, but waste is a huge part of what you get visibility-wise out of menu engineering when you've done that work. Also, for those of you who are multi-unit concepts and have more than one location, a lot of times it's a good idea to share prepped product. It's crucial that you build out those recipes so you can understand the true cost of that product, and so you can transfer the cost accurately at each location and make sure that the food cost is on the correct location's profit and loss statement so that you can truly evaluate each restaurant individually and each restaurant's P&L individually and evaluate, hey, are you guys getting a high five, or do you have an opportunity when it comes to managing your waste and managing your food cost? Also, of your menu engineering, this allows you to identify winners and losers. You got to look at how much you're selling of each recipe, so that's your quantity sold, versus how much money you're making on each recipe, which is your margin. And when we're talking about margin here, remember, margin is the opposite of cost. So in Sid's example earlier, if she had a recipe item that was costed out at 30%, that means your margin is 70%. So you want that margin to be higher. When we plot this out on a graph at RSI, we call this the 4R graph. And let's start with the easiest. So in the top right quadrant of this graph, if it's a high quantity sold and a high margin, this is a winner, and this needs to be retained, and this should make sense. You sell a lot of it and you make a lot of money on it. Let's keep those items all day. Don't even worry about them. If it's high quantity sold but a poor margin, you may need to look at repricing this item. You're selling a lot of it, but you aren't making as much in margin. If it's high margin, low quantity sold, this is replate. So take a look at how you're merchandising these recipe items. You want to sell more of them. You're making a good margin, but you just aren't selling enough of them. And the other one that should be kind of obvious is if it's low quantity sold and low margin, okay, go back to the drawing board. This is one you want to rethink. This is an item that your customers aren't buying, and even if they did, you aren't making a great margin on them. So rethink that item, get it to where people will buy it, and you make a better profit or a better margin on it. Sid, while we're talking about margins, there's a lot of ways RSI can help RSI clients save money through purchasing. Let's talk a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, and I think that, for those of you that have been on it before, we've talked about our purchasing program, but this has been really impactful, and I've been so excited to see the momentum that this particular program has had for our clients. It's zero cost to our clients first and foremost, so it's a no-brainer on that end of things. But our purchasing team has been really dedicated to finding ways to save RSI clients money, and we're always looking for new programs to add to the list and items to add to the list. Currently, we have 56 food programs consisting of over 9,500 items, and of those 9,500, 1,500 items have a greater than $10 per case rebate. We work with brands like La Brea, Otis Spunkmeyer, Pennant, La France. Those programs feature over 400 items with a $16 average per case rebate. We also are representing brands like Knorr and Hellmann's, Lookout, and Lipton. Their items will return a $10 average, with a portfolio averaging around $8.50 per case. So where I'm going with this, if you're reviewing and updating your items on your menu, be sure to check in with our purchasing department too to see if they can help suggest items that might provide you greater value or efficiency for your operation. Let's say you're using an airline chicken breast, maybe you're using Tyson as your brand and you have a certain case price on that. We might actually be able to source out a different branded airline chicken breast that may actually have a lower cost to you. So there's definitely some opportunity for all of our clients to be able to maximize as many manufacturer rebates as possible. And if the food program isn't going to work with your purchasing needs, then we still might be able to help you with non-food related programs as well. Since to-go is such a main thing right now, we have actually partnered up with Dark Container. Dark Container manufactures cups, plates, containers, lids, sauces, little souffle cups. There's over 1,200 Dart and Solo items on this rebate program as well. And 900 of those items are over $10 average rebate, with some of them being over $50. So, in line with, costing out your menu, make sure that we can be, you check the velocity of those item prices. And if you see something like going up and it's not coming back down, we might actually have a solution for you of finding a similar like product that may even be better quality, but that may be of a better value to you. So make sure that you are taking advantage of our purchasing rebate program as well.
And Sid, I think every restaurant has gone through a little bit of evaluation, probably more intensely than they ever have, of all their expenses on their P&L during the pandemic. And
Absolutely.
What I'm hearing you say is, hey, you may have some deals you can get just for being an RSI client that you may not be aware of. So as you're vetting out new vendors or new ways to spend your money, or maybe, hey, this to-go box instead of this to-go box, include our purchasing team in that process just to see if you're missing out on anything. No harm, no foul if it doesn't help you, but you might as well look at all the options available to you.
Well said, Brett. I couldn't agree more. Now, we've been discussing the difference between recipe costing and menu engineering, but there is also a difference between theoretical cost of goods and actual cost of goods. So keep in mind that theoretical is solely based off of what was sold and the cost of those items. Now, when you're actually figuring out your actual cost of goods, then this is when your inventory and purchases come into play. When you are reviewing cost of goods on your financial statements, remember, you are actually looking at usage dollars. Your basic cost of goods formula is taking that first beginning inventory, the week of purchases and credits, and then taking that, subtracting out the ending inventory to then equal out what your total usage dollar expense is. Now, this is going to be different from your theoretical cost of goods. If you've got any issues with counting errors, missed invoices, credits, waste, spoilage, mishandling, theft, that's really where you'll find that variance between theoretical and actual. So item variance is between, what was sold versus what your actual cost was. So if you sold, say, 50 wings and you went through 60 wings, then you've got a variance of 10 wings. Times that by the cost of the wing, and that's your usage. That's that variance cost. So by engineering out your recipes, you're not only going to get insight into what your cost categories should be at, but they're also what items are impacting those overall cost categories. Now, we've talked about waste and theft, et cetera. Brian, I know that you mentioned earlier we're going to revisit waste again, so let's dive into that.
My favorite thing to jump into. Let's talk about waste. So like Sid said, you have an actual cost, you have a theoretical cost. The difference you can really narrow down to 4 things that are all certain versions of waste, but let's talk through those versions. So now that I've identified a waste problem, how do I narrow that down? And the most traditional reason is true waste spoilage due to over-ordering. Revenue, sales have changed significantly, and you're likely finding a new sales baseline, and your team's getting used to a new baseline, a new normal for right now. Are your order writers writing a unique order each week in line with the sales that you're forecasting? And how do you decide what those par levels should be? Sid, I know you've had some success with this specifically, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about really keeping track of the waste. You should be having a log sheet, making sure that the kitchen manager and the bar managers are logging every single thing that gets wasted, looking at the trim excess, et cetera. So that way, they can identify if there is training issues that you need to work with your cooks on, et cetera, to, reduce the amount of spoilage and waste, et cetera, that's happening. Also, that goes into play with that ordering levels we talked about as well.
And the worst thing you can do is copy that same order from week to week, especially right now, or even worse, let your vendor decide what your order should be. If anybody's doing that right now, give me a call. I'll convince you to stop it.
Absolutely.
All right. Next up, if we're dividing waste into 4 main categories, next up for me is error. And for me, I've worked with enough back house teams that I'm sure I'll get a lot of smiles from our back house people on this call, but a lot of finger pointing towards the front of house, making sure that they're ringing everything in correctly, making sure that they're not just calling back for mistakes they made, or making sure that they're doing everything properly through the point of sale. With a ton of restaurants I work with, there's a lot of opportunity to do that correctly, and it has impact on all these menu engineering reports that we're talking about today. So making sure, identifying, hey, is there a potential error problem with how the front of house is making the product, and what triggers the back of house to make product? Does it have to come through the point of sale, or are they relying on the front of house to just call back orders? I think that can be a big help. The next thing is portion size. So you're setting these expectations for your recipes. And I'll go back to my Moscow Mule, and gosh, it stings my heart, but eyeballing a bulk recipe can have a big impact, right? So making sure you're setting these expectations with your team on what portion sizes are, making sure they're sticking to those and following the recipes and expectations you're laying out. Restaurants are a business of pennies, and that one extra penny you're putting in every ramekin for your dressing is going to add up to a lot of dollars at the end of the year, and right to your bottom line. So portion size is a big thing that I would encourage you to research if you have a waste problem. The last one here is theft. And this is the product going out your back door? Are your bartenders giving away drinks to their friends or regulars without ringing them in? This is usually the last reason anybody wants it to be. You don't want to believe that there's theft going on, but you need to be eyes wide open about that kind of thing, especially when you're researching why there's a difference between your actual cost and your theoretical cost. When I used to work through these scenarios with my teams, I used the acronym WEPT. Sometimes acronyms can help people remember as they're going through that kind of troubleshooting, and WEPT is waste, error, portion, and theft. So I found that helpful when I was working with my teams in the restaurants.
Yeah.
All right.
That mishandling of the product, I'd say, if you have your theoretical costs, you've costed out your menu, et cetera, and your overall theoretical cost is probably running at 28%, then I would say, for actual costs for budgeting purposes, you probably want to account for at least 2% over and above that for mishandling, theft, waste, spoilage, et cetera. That might be a little bit lower on the bar side, but for food, I'd say usually around, I would go with about 2% would be my recommendation. Brian, what would you think?
Yeah, right there. I think 1 to 2% if you're really good and really apt at managing that cost, but sometimes that's not realistic, and you have to have somewhere to improve. So maybe higher to begin with. Okay, so
it really does depend on concept type as well. If you're all
no doubt.
So that will definitely fluctuate on if you're just throwing stuff into the fryer, no fluctuation.
No doubt. Sid, we are over the half an hour. We didn't leave a ton of time, but I'd still like to get to a couple of questions. Thank you so much for those questions that came in throughout the presentation. If we don't get to answer them right now, we will answer you directly as well. Sid, as I'm going through these, I can identify some themes. Some people have similar questions worded differently. And the first one I'm going to grab is one I know we get a lot, so I'm going to send it your way, Sid. And the question is, should I be factoring in labor dollars or packaging costs into the recipe? So they're building out these recipes with the raw ingredients. Should they put a dollar amount to their labor dollars that go into prepping this, or the box that they have to put it in a to-go box for?
It is a great question, and obviously this does come up a lot. And I think we've actually hearing it more just because you are working on kind of a to-go menu right now, and so you're like, oh, I should be putting in the packaging cost into this or the labor. And basically the short answer is no. We would not recommend that. When you're really costing out your menu, you're costing out consumable product. Your cost of goods, your food cost, your pork cost is based solely off of what is actually that you are consuming. Labor, that's a whole separate line item, and that's going to be handled and budgeted out accordingly based off of your overall total of operations, not on one single menu item. And with packaging, again, that should be managed, so, obviously an operating expense that you should be tracking and making sure that you're keeping purchasing in line. But I would never recommend to include those line items into the actual theoretical cost or ideal cost of your ingredients. You want to keep that completely separate. Budgeted for sure, but separate.
I was going to say, it's not a Sid or Brian call unless we talk about budgeting. You still need to budget for that stuff, just not in your cost of goods, not in your food cost or pour cost. There's other places to keep you in line there.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more, Brian.
All right, Sid. Okay, here's another one that we hear a lot of. How does anyone have time to build out their entire menu? That is a fair question. As someone who has gone through and built out an entire menu with recipes, that's not a quick process. That takes a long time. And what I always recommend to clients I'm working with who do this is go through some item quantity sold reports, identify those signature items, those velocity items, the ones that are at the top of your quantity sold reports, and start with those recipes. You just got to do it one recipe at a time. If you try to say, I'm going to set aside this week and build out my entire menu, for some people, that's going to burn you out and you're going to die. I would not recommend that. One recipe at a time, do it in slow chunks. What's the joke? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Same with menu engineering. How do you menu engineer your whole menu? One recipe at a time. Just be strategic about which recipes you're doing, and you'll be really surprised. Once you identify those top 5 or 6 recipes velocity-wise, that's your theoretical food cost right there. You actually don't need to menu engineer your whole menu to get a perfect theoretical food cost. Yeah, eventually get there. But once you identify those velocity items, that's good enough. That'll tell you where you should be following. And then, like Sydney and I said, a 1, 2, 3%, depending on how good your team is at managing that waste, a 1, 2, 3% bump for your budget, what you should actually be aiming for. So if you cost out your food program to a 25% even, you should be aiming for a 27, 28% when it comes to food cost, and then look for improvements after you dial that in.
Well said. I know that there's some questions out there that are very specific. They may not be applicable to everybody, so we will definitely be responding back to every single question that was on here. We really appreciate all of your time and attention to this. And if there are any follow-up questions on this, up on the top of your screen, you'll see our direct email, clientadvisors@rsiaccounting.com. Any further questions that you might have on it or something specific to RSI, feel free to reach out to us as well.
I did see some questions, Sid, come in anonymously too. So if we didn't get to your question and we don't have your information, obviously we won't be able to answer you directly. So feel free, use our email addresses, our client advisors at rsiaccounting.com, and ask us those directly if you'd like as well. We're happy to answer.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time and best of luck.